on the second morning of our conference. I'm very happy to see that you're all back and looking forward to more good discussions today. So in my talk I will cover several aspects of how punishment is advantageous or propitious for the evolution of cooperation. As we have heard many times now, cooperation is always under the threat of free riding, with some members of the group supposed to engage in a joint enterprise, opting out and relying on the effort of others to carry the burden of maintaining the task of safeguarding the public good or investing into the joint effort. This is known as social dilemma. We had a wonderful talk by Christoph yesterday, also highlighting that other names are in use, like N-person's prisoner's dilemma or social dilemmas, free rider problem. But it was Garrett Hardin who pointed out how ubiquitous such a situation is. The kind of paradigmatic nature of this tragedy of the commons, I think, has been greatly aided by his article, which was already published, if I recall correctly, in '68. Even much earlier, moral philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau were considering the state of anarchy that man was supposed to have lived in ancestrally, and they mused about how that was transformed into the civilized, or relatively civilized state of affairs that he witnessed. And his notion, quite an abstract, conceptual one, is that of a social contract. Man in the state of anarchy voluntarily agrees to submit to a social contract so that man would be protected from free riding by the society at large and subject himself or herself to the rules of that society. And it is in this sense that Rousseau said, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. This was not an early communist statement, but the idea that man voluntarily accepts these chains in exchange for a safe life free of anarchy. Much more recently, Elinor Ostrom has researched the governing of the commons as the means of overcoming the tragedy of the commons. And here's a quote from her: "Institutions are tools that offer incentives to enable humans to overcome social dilemmas." And I would like to stress here also, in the spirit she has developed, that institutions can be a very flexible, very broad notion. It can range from simple agreements between friends, just a statement, let's do it this way, and then a mutual understanding that it will be done this way, all the way up to international treaties between nations. The research she has focused on is on small scale or bottom-up emergence of institutions in groups such as clubs, especially when they are confronted with exploiting natural resources, and also in tribal societies. Another institution that has been very dominant in Europe over the millennia and has its counterparts in other corners of the world is the Christian Church, imposing a moral code and threatening, often direly, consequences that will be meted out in this life and in the afterlife if people do not behave according to conventions. So the threatening, angry God of the Old Testament was depicted by Michelangelo in his famous painting in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican, and it epitomizes the idea that we carry around a conscience that internalizes many of the threats of punishment that a society might enact and impose. So we carry around, in a sense, our own rule book, and we have this strong sense of unease or moral guilt resulting from violating the rules in that book. Punishment by libertarian philosophers is often regarded as a means of a hierarchical organization of society, and therefore is sometimes despised. But I think it's important to realize that the incentives that Ostrom speaks about can be of positive kinds, rewards, of negative kinds, punishment, and they can be of a monetary sort, or of a social sort, or even of a psychological sort. So when we talk about punishment, we should maybe not be afraid of this threatening God of the Old Testament, but appreciate that negative incentives in this lighter and more general sense are ubiquitous all around us. Game theoretical studies have traditionally focused on the evolution of the cooperative behavior as such, and have investigated historically the conditions under which that evolution would be favored, such as kin selection or group selection. And increasingly, over the last 10 or maybe already 20 years, game theoretical studies now also address the design of institutions and incentives, the evolution or the emergence of social norms, of social contracts, if one wants to use that bold word, to safeguard cooperation. So it becomes a two-tracked affair, the evolution of the cooperative behavior itself and the evolution of the social behavior or institutional conventions that are needed to safeguard and protect the cooperative behavior from unfolding. In this introductory talk, I would like to cover two pieces of research that we have engaged in. This is part, obviously, of a much broader effort by an international community, and we are just adding two small facets to that broad effort. It's all about punishment, that also motivated the title, Propitious Punishment. And in the first study, I will talk about combining punishment with voluntary participation. In the second study, combining punishment or the evolution of punishment with the evolution of social norms. And then I'm happy to add a little promotion here for Jean-Jacques' talk, which is also about joint research where punishment is hybridized with rewarding in a way that is optimal for the evolution of cooperation. So let me then turn right away to the first study about the joint action of negative incentives and optional participation. This was published just about more than 1 year ago, and I'm very delighted to acknowledge my co-authors. First author was Tatsuya Sasaki, also here with us, and also giving us a talk later in the conference, Åke Brännström. Second author, also we will hear from him tomorrow, and unfortunately Carl Sigmund, as explained, is not with us. The model is a fairly standard one, not very complicated in fact. Consider a well-mixed population of players in which random samples of n players are continually invited or recurrently invited to participate in public good games. Each invited player then first decides whether to participate, and second, whether to cooperate. So first they decide whether they join the offered public good game, the joint enterprise, or whether they go it alone and stay solitary and not join the public good game. All cooperating players in the public good game make a contribution C, and all participating players pay a cost. So there's a cost of participation, and obtain a shared benefit that is proportional to the sum of contributions by the other players. So that's the nature of a public good game, but we made it even a little bit harder than the public good game already is by restricting the return of contributions to other players. So what you pay into the joint pool is split and then distributed to the other players only. That ensures that we are talking about a pure social dilemma, because there are clearly no returns whatsoever of your investment to yourself. And then on top of that, so this is a very standard setup, the only thing that we really added is the social institution that issues rewards and penalties. And here I should say a few words about the types of punishment or sanctions that has been discussed in the literature, the most important type, and by far the most commonly covered in game theoretical studies, is so-called peer punishment, where individuals decide to punish another individual, one of their peers, according to the actions or history of actions of that individual. That is supposedly the situation we would encounter in an ancestral society where there is just no institution around. At the second level of organization, we might have so-called pool punishment. That arises when players recognize that this individualized form of punishment is maybe not most efficient. For example, because of the threat of retribution that individuals attract when they engage in this punishment, often further aggravating the challenge of second-order free riding by people avoiding costly punishment. So what they then can do is to enter resources into a pool, for example, to hire a sheriff or to pay for any kind of other institution that keeps up the social order. And then finally, maybe after further evolution of this institution, we would have an institution that has become so strong that it can levy its own taxes, that can just force the players by its authority, like in the social contract, to submit and to secure the perpetuity of this institution, and that is institutional punishment. So we have these three levels of punishment. Here I'm talking about the first. So here's just a recap of what is very well known about punishment and rewarding under compulsory participation. So in this first diagram I show you the baseline case when there is no volunteering. So individuals cannot refuse to join the public enterprise. From left to right, I'm showing you the effects of very small incentives to very large incentives that the social institution can provide. In each of these lines, you see the frequency of cooperators, and you see the space, the trajectories, and you see the outcome. So if the institutions have too little budget and cannot pay much of an incentive, then very naturally the population of agents ends up with full defection. Not surprising. And if the institution is very powerful and can give very high rewards or very high penalties, then we have the opposite outcome, and everybody cooperates just because the institution forces them to do so. Now, in between we have interesting cases of intermediate incentives, and here we have to distinguish between the case of rewarding and punishing. In the case of rewarding, we can shift the attractor slightly away from defection in proportion to the reward offered. So with little rewards, we are not far away from a full defection, and then we move it further until eventually we have full cooperation. So that's nice, but it's a very costly way of bringing about cooperation, because the higher you want to push the frequency of cooperators, the more rewards you must offer. With punishment, we have a different problem. We have bistability. So this intermediate equilibrium is a repeller, and to the right, any frequency of cooperators reverts to full defection, and above it reverts to full cooperation. So this is very good when you already have an almost fully cooperative group, because then punishment takes it all the way to full cooperation. But if you're in this range, it's extremely hard to escape it. You can call it a social trap, that the population remains stuck in full defection even though the institution is offering incentives. So this is a totally wasteful institutionalized effort, because it achieves nothing. The institution does not prevent the group to stay stuck at full defection. So this is the state of affairs without voluntary. Now, surprisingly, this changes a lot when you add volunteering. So we now unfold the state space by adding the third corner of these standard triangles. The N stands for non-participating players, or loners, as they're sometimes called in the literature. And the interior of the triangle shows you the dynamics of the frequencies of these three types of players. On the left, very small incentives, we see what we saw before, but with a twist. Now, not everybody is not defecting, but just not participating in what is an inherently unattractive game. So they escape the danger of full defection and just become non-participants. So that's already a little bit better, but it's zero cooperation. On the right, a very powerful institution wasting a lot of money on incentives. We go to full cooperation, no surprise. So the interesting story is in between. And there we can again distinguish between rewarding in the top row and punishing in the bottom row. In the top row, the situation is not much changed. We stay at non-participation for a little bit longer than in the case of the compulsory participation. We stay with defection, and then the population reverts to participation and partial cooperation. That's the outcome here, just as before. An intermediate attractor between cooperation and defection, gradually shifting towards full cooperation as incentives are increased. Okay, that's nice, but maybe not so surprising. The real surprise is in the bottom row. Now we are dealing with an institution meting out negative sanctions, and the transition from here to here is startling. With very small incentives, the outcome of the population ends up with full cooperation, and that stays all the way as incentive magnitude is increased. So the jump from here to here, that's the main story of this talk. With little incentives, you change this face portrait into this face portrait, favoring full cooperation. And now it is important to pay attention to the scale down here. The incentives needed for this are C over N. C was the cost of contributing and N was the number of players. So surprisingly, as the number of players goes up, this minimal cost needed for making the transition even becomes smaller. We did several robustness checks to ascertain the generality of these results. We can include contributors that benefit from their own contributions, participants that finance a social institution, unused incentives being returned, only one defector being punished, penalties diminishing with the number of defectors, and penalties being capped. All these versions of the model maintain this basic result. So in conclusion, we see that voluntary participation fundamentally improves the efficiency of incentives. Using it, institutions punishing defectors can overcome the social dilemma at a fractional cost. This promotes a globally stable regime of cooperation and thus removes the social trap. That means that whenever a society of cooperators cannot be invaded by the defectors, when it's safe against this invasion, it will become established in the long run, irrespective of the initial number of cooperators. And finally, punishing provides a much lighter touch than rewarding, guaranteeing full cooperation at considerably lower cost. So this is an interesting twist on the story that people usually prefer rewarding because it feels nice. But in some sense, the punishing in this system is, I would say, the nicer option for the majority of players. And with that, I would like to switch for a brief while to the second part of this talk. I will make it fast, in which I consider norm evolution in conjunction with punishment. This is already a few years back, research done jointly with Yuko Nakamaru from Japan, from Tokyo. Here we consider continuous strategies. And I think that is a still underappreciated area in the field of cooperation evolution. It was already started 15 years ago, and Michael Döbeli was perhaps one of the forerunners in this. And what we consider here is an extension. We don't only consider continuous cooperation levels, but also continuous punishment levels and a continuous reaction norm or social norm mediating between the two. So here's this punishment reaction norm. On the horizontal axis we have the cooperation level, vertical axis the punishment level. If co-players, and we are back to peer punishment here, if co-players contribute too little, they get punished a lot. If co-players contribute a lot, they get punished hardly at all. And this implies a social definition of defectors and cooperators, which we could call a social construction. It's not imposed by the modeler, it is decided democratically among the agents what is a defector and what is a cooperator. We consider the evolution of 4 evolving strategies, 4 adaptive traits: the cooperation level, and that is changing on the horizontal axis; the punishment threshold, which is the inflection point of the sigmoidal curve; the punishment severity, which is its maximum; and the punishment strictness, which is the slope at the inflection point. For robustness, we consider a few sigmoidal functions, and it turns out not to matter. So just to ease everybody's mind that the choice of sigmoid here does not matter. We consider costs, both for cooperation and punishment, which are allometrically scaling with the investments. So we consider linear cases, but also decelerating and accelerating cases. Now comes the model. It's a spatial model in which neighbors interact. We have the 30 by 30 square grid with occupied and empty sites. Interactions occur in the nearest neighbor, or von Neumann neighborhood, and cooperation is followed by punishment. We have a biological underpinning here, so we use death rates, which are increased from baseline by received punishment and incurred costs, and birth rates that are increased from baseline by received cooperation contribution. The offspring of individuals, according to their birth rate, is placed on a random neighboring site and is lost if that site is already occupied. And these offspring strategies undergo mutation in their traits with a small probability and multivariate normal effects. For well-mixed populations, we have analytical results. These are nice but boring. Namely, we show that selection on punishment severity, how much is punished, is driven by punishment costs alone. And without punishment, selection on cooperation level is driven by cooperation costs alone. So costs dominate the picture, not the benefits but the costs. And therefore, in the presence of these costs, cooperation and punishment levels evolve to 0. No cooperation, no punishment. A very boring case. Now come the first results of the spatial model. We have evolution with fixed strictness. So the slope of the sigmoid is now fixed, and we only let 3 traits evolve. And here you see how, as a function of this punishment strictness, these 3 traits evolve. We see that the stricter the punishment, the higher the achieved cooperation level, and the higher, very slightly below only, the achieved punishment threshold. And we also see that the punishment severity is going up, but not at all as much as the cooperation level. So with higher strictness, you get a much better ratio between cooperation level and punishment severity. So in summary, cooperation and punishment can undergo runaway selection with evolution towards enhanced cooperation and an ever more demanding punishment reaction norm mutually reinforcing each other. The evolved punishment severity is a lot smaller than the evolved cooperation level. And this mechanism works best, as we have seen, when punishment is strict, so that ambiguities in defining defectors are small. So basically everybody defines a defector as those individuals that give a little bit less than oneself. Yeah, they use their own behavior as a yardstick, and then anybody who gives a little bit less is punished. Now we also allowed the 4th trait to evolve, evolution with adaptable strictness. And now we don't have the strictness on the horizontal axis, but type. So we start from a situation in which there is no cooperation and no punishment, and actually no strictness. And then we let all 3 evolve, and we see that they bootstrap. I like to use this word in this condition because we have really nothing, no cooperation, no punishment at the beginning, and then seemingly out of nothing, the society manages to pull itself up on its own bootstraps and become a cooperative group. So the 4th result is then when the strictness of punishment adapts jointly with the threshold and severity of punishment, evolution favors the strict and severe punishment of individuals who offer slightly less than average cooperation levels. And the last part of our results concerns the costs. Here you have the allometric exponents for cooperation and punishment on the axis, so the linear cases are in the center, 1, 1. And you see punishment really only evolves where two conditions are met. The first is that cooperation or punishment are not too costly. The superlinear regions are basically corresponding to accelerating costs that is not attractive, and therefore neither cooperation nor punishment can evolve. And also, the system of punishment does not evolve when it's not needed, when you have sublinear increase of costs with contribution levels, cooperative contribution levels. It's a very favorable situation for the evolution of cooperation, and punishment is just not needed. So basically, this punishment evolves where it's needed and affordable. So the fifth result, strict and severe punishment naturally evolves and leads to a much enhanced cooperation, when cooperation without punishment would be weak, and neither cooperation nor punishment are too costly. Again, a few robustness checks. We considered synchronous instead of asynchronous updating, baseline birth and death rates that varied in magnitude, alternative reactional functions. I showed you the three we considered, implementation and perception errors, and mutation probabilities and standard deviations were also varied. In all these conditions, the results prevailed. And with that, I come to the conclusions of the second part. As I have highlighted, what I really like about these results is they explain the simultaneous bootstrapping of cooperation and punishment in a continuous sense, from zero to something. There's an anarchic society without cooperation in the beginning, and it turns itself without any imposition from the outside into a cooperative society in which a social norm has emerged that sustains cooperation. So defectors who never punish gradually and steadily evolve into cooperators who punish those they define as defectors. From a moral point of view, if you want to get a little bit philosophical, what is really interesting here is that effective punishment and this bootstrapping requires a value system that is not static, but that has shifting baselines. What is a defector gradually changes as evolution progresses, and if you would fix it, the progression could not happen. So I think that's a good reminder that sometimes we need to be flexible about our value systems, because the shifting baselines may actually be needed for cooperation to emerge. Eventually, of course, diminishing returns will stop the runaway process. That's well known from other studies. We didn't go into that. I want to highlight that strategies represented as continuous quantitative traits, which undergo gradual evolution, enable steady strategy adjustments driven by the subtle mutual reinforcement of selection pressures. This is different from what is often considered in terms of discrete strategies, where discrete increases in punishment threshold or severity might not be selectively advantageous. So if you did the same study with a few chosen sets of discrete levels, it might just not work. So this continuous representation is probably quite important for this phenomenon to unfold. As I've already highlighted in this study, the dichotomy between cooperators and defectors emerges as a result, whereas in most other studies, excluding those, for example, also of Christoph Howard and co-workers on continuous prisoners' dilemmas, in most other studies it's being stipulated as an assumption. And then a few more broader ranging interpretations. These results provide an evolutionary explanation for a common cultural predisposition for strict but fair punishment. This is actually a variant of what sometimes is called a zero tolerance approach to law enforcement. Either you are behaving according to rules, or even at the slightest transgression you are severely punished. It works, even though it is not very comfortable or not necessarily very humane. Nevertheless, it is an integral part of many moral systems and legal codes, and it is often touted as an effective approach to education, re-education, military discipline, and the preservation of public order. Thank you.
Thank Professor interesting talks. So, questions?
Thank you very much for this nice overview of punishment and moral systems to evolve. One thing, I'm always intrigued by the differences between a rewarding system and a punishment system. And so basically I was wondering, did you try this continuous evolution of a moral system for rewarding, for rewarding opportunities? And the reason why I'm asking, that maybe links to the first part of your talk, is I'm intrigued by the psychological differences between rewarding and punishment in the sense that having a rewarding institution maybe from a psychological perspective, you get very easily accustomed to obtaining that reward. And as soon as the reward fails to be provided, then it becomes essentially a punishment scenario. So that the reward basically changes the rules of the game, and the absence of a reward turns into punishment. So the two are not all that different anymore. But if you look at the continuous evolution, there may be differences. So have you thought about this?
That's a wonderful question, and the simple answer is no, because the first study predates the second, and we haven't redone it in terms of rewarding. But I fully agree that it would be exciting to do so. I also like your idea of reinterpreting the absence of customarily received rewards as punishment. I think that's a very interesting twist on the story, and probably one can also find mathematical repercussions of that in the analysis. In general, however, and that is something that we will hear about more in Jean-Jacques' talk, rewarding is very good, as we saw in the phase diagrams, for getting cooperation off the ground. Right? It's a good jump starter for cooperation. It's quite a terrible maintainer of cooperation when you think about the costs. So giving everybody in a fully cooperative society's rewards could be ruinous to the institution, and therefore also to the agents potentially paying for the institution. And that is different from punishment. So this shaming that you were talking about is, in monetary terms, probably it's so much more efficient because it hardly costs anything, and the little costs that arise are mostly in social resources rather than monetary resources. So from that perspective, I would actually expect, and that's pure speculation, that the bootstrapping might be working even better with rewarding, because that's getting off the ground phenomenon. But we would have to do the analysis to answer the question.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah. This report is very good. So I have a question. I say in your first part, I say in your chapter they are settle and think. Then this is, in Markov chain, I never seen that. Zone is a linear system, but this is my first time to see settle and think. So in this process, do you see another mechanism properties, such as limit cycle or center?
Right. Yeah, in some nonlinear versions of the game, we see limit cycles, yes. Centers not so much, because that is a degenerate case of an attractor. The saddles, of course, can undergo saddle node bifurcations, and that is basically what happens between these triangles I showed you. The bifurcations are of that kind. And other than that, I suggest we talk maybe a bit more after the talk, because I'm not quite sure I understand your question about saddles and things.
So you have limit cycle. This is mean maybe you have a hop verification.
Indeed, yeah.
So this is not just a linear system, maybe it's a non-linear system.
Yeah, as I said, in versions of this model which I have not shown, I seem to recall that we can find limit cycles, and of course they originate through a hop bifurcation.
So it's just for the Markov to make the Markov linear Markov chain to a nonlinear one.
Yeah, we need nonlinearity for limit cycles. Yeah, but let's talk about them more afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you very much, Professor. And I'm wondering, though, you said the severity somehow enforce the cooperation in the group. Is this understanding right?
I didn't catch your word. The serenity?
Yeah, the severity. Yes.
Severity.
Okay. So I'm not sure what kind of strategy or the mechanism, punishment mechanism, which one you use. Is the green trigger or some Wednesday shift? Because I think the green trigger is very severe, maybe very strict punishment scheme, right? But the Wednesday shift, it's only punished one shot, and after that maybe it comes back to cooperation. But sometimes I think the green trigger not always enforce the mutual cooperation. But once the loose shift may be more effective, maybe more efficient.
Right.
So
I think you may be a little bit confused here about history one strategies as opposed to non-reactive strategies. So our second study, which is about peer punishment, is about non-reactive strategies. Investments C are made irrespective of what has been invested by the co-players. It is only the punishment that is reactive, and it only has a history depth of 1.
okay, all right. And do you consider to introduce this introduce the TFT or other mechanism to your study?
I think it would be an interesting extension to also allow the cooperation strategy to have some history 1 or even longer dependence, and then see how continuous punishment might evolve on top of that. But it gets a bit complicated, you know. These history N strategies are not customarily considered in the context of continuous cooperation, even though I agree they would be nice. And if they were, then in the context of reaction norms of the kind I showed. So I think it opens new ground if you want to have a history N strategy in the context of continuous cooperation, and even more so in the context of continuous punishment.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Other questions? Okay. Yes, thank both again. Okay.